I hope you enjoy. Nis hechenu en iripat, sa nesusemes en chetef, meriev, Ramesses Ma'acheru. Recitation of praise by the hereditary noble, the king's eldest son of his body, his beloved, Ramesses, true of voice. An offering for the king of the south, Meni, for Teti, for Ateti, for Ata, Chesepti, Merpabia, Irinecher, Keber. Around 1300 BCE, give or take, the halls of Seti's temple at Abydos rang with the sound of chisels. Sculptors were hard at work on decorative scenes in one of the side corridors. This passageway is now known as the Hall of Lists, for it is adorned on one wall with a list of the ancient kings stretching all the way back to the founder, and on the other wall a list of shrines, sacred sanctuaries dedicated to great gods. Both of these lists begin with an image of the ruling pharaoh, Men-Ma'at-Ra, Sety, beloved of Ptah, who burns incense and raises a hand in greeting to the kings and to the gods. But the pharaoh does not act alone. Unusually, he is attended by a prince, his eldest son, Ramesses, commonly known as Ramesses II. The king and the prince appear together to honor the royal ancestors and the shrines of the great deities. These scenes, along with several others, reveal an unusual political story, by which King Sety elevated his son to a position of prominence in the court and the government, and then presented him publicly as his chosen heir. The tale of Ramesses Rising comes together from several monuments and inscriptions. It is also a tale that Ramesses himself was extremely eager to share. Setabenra, men pechtira, men ma'adra. Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 194, A Prince of Egypt, or Ramesses Rising. In the middle years of his father's reign, the prince Ramesses, or Ramesses, began to gain prominence and visibility within the regime of Sety I. To Western ears, such an act may seem perfectly normal. Why wouldn't the king promote his son and heir? But in the traditions of ancient Egypt, it actually is extremely unusual. Sety I promoted his son far beyond the norms and habits of his ancestors. Why did he do this? How did he do it? And what were the limits of the young prince's authority? These questions have bedeviled scholars for decades, but with the right sources and some expert assistance, we will explore them today. When his father became pharaoh, Ramesses II was approximately 10 years old. That means he was born in the reign of Horemheb, in the later years of the 18th dynasty. And as a child, young Ramesses likely grew up in a family of wealth with strong connections to the military apparatus and the Egyptian government. The young boy might not have expected the path that his family took when Horemheb appointed Ramesses' grandfather, Ramesses I, to be his chosen successor. The fortunes of this Ramessid clan changed almost overnight, and for the young boy, things changed further when his grandfather passed away after a reign of just 1 or 2 years. Suddenly, Ramesses II found himself the eldest son of the reigning king of Egypt. Ramesses would describe this period later on in his life. When he had become the pharaoh, he looked back on this early phase and explained it in grandiose terms. We'll come back to that in a few moments. But first, I want to get a sense of how Sety promoted his young son to a position of prominence within the court. We have already explored one chapter of this tale in episode 185, when Sety gave to Ramesses his own household with beautiful women, or neferu, to be his wives and lovers. From the time he reached puberty, young Ramesses was sexually active and began to sire multiple children with multiple women. Similarly, in the last episode, we saw how King Sety presented his son in a symbolic rite of passage in the bull corridor of the Abydos temple. There, an image of Sety and Ramesses lassoing and subduing a bull conveyed their royal power, their dominance over nature, and their strength to rule. These two expressions, in the form of a household and an artistic religious symbolism, give a hint at the plans Sety had made for his son. Now he could go further. In another hall of Sety's temple, just next to the bull corridor, we have a pair of lists. One of these is the Abydos King List, a record of the legitimate rulers who had governed the Nile Valley since time immemorial. The other list is a record of shrines, the holy sanctuaries of Egypt's greatest gods. I described both of these lists in episode 187, but there is one feature that I didn't talk about there. You see, both of these lists start with an image of the king, who stands before the respective inscriptions and makes praises and offerings to the object of his affections. Notably, both the Abydos King List and the Abydos Shrine List also feature an image of Ramesses. The young prince stands before his father in each of these scenes. He usually appears in priestly garb with fine quality robes made of linen. His head is shaved except for a thick braid that runs down one side. This side lock is a characteristic image of youth in ancient Egyptian art, which means that Sety intentionally presented his son as a child participating in these sacred rituals. These scenes are quite unusual for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we don't see children acting as priests. That is an adult's job, requiring literacy, purification, and initiation into the sacred, restricted knowledge. It is also extremely unusual for a prince to appear at all in this kind of scene. As a general rule, the Egyptian monarchs did not like to present their sons visibly on monuments and in art. There might be different reasons for this, perhaps to avoid power plays or conflict within the extended family. Or maybe there was a religious dimension to it. Since the king was the living incarnation of Horus, it didn't really make sense to have a successor visibly waiting in the wings. The result is that across the millennia of pharaonic history, the royal sons, princes, tend to be shadowy and obscure. This political invisibility was still popular up to the reign of Sety I. Even his father, Ramesses I, did not promote him visibly in art or monuments as the chosen heir, and Ramesses' own patron, King Horemheb, did not present him visibly as the chosen successor. Granted, it is entirely possible that such monuments have been lost to time or accident, but it seems like Horemheb and Ramesses continued the habits of their forebears. Sety broke with that tradition when he presented Ramesses as a child participating in religious and specifically royal rituals. The depictions of Ramesses in the temple at Abydos are far more significant than they appear at first glance. He shouldn't be here, all things considered. Several years after these images were carved, Ramesses himself came back to Abydos. By that point, Sety I was dead, and Ramesses had inherited the crowns and become pharaoh in his own right. In the first year of his reign, shortly after his coronation, Ramesses returned to Abydos to visit his father's temple. On that visit, Ramesses commissioned an inscription that would adorn the front of the temple and describe the king's piety towards his deceased father, the great gods within, and describe the king's childhood and upbringing in the court of Sety. This record is known as the Abydos Dedicatory Text. You can find this inscription on the front wall of the monument, just behind the square pillars that decorate its facade. The dedicatory inscription is on the left when you are looking towards the temple, and in a long series of columns, hieroglyphs record Ramesses' version of events. I won't read the whole inscription here. It's quite long, and it also has several religious elements that deserve greater discussion. For now, I just want to focus on the biographical section when Ramesses describes his childhood. As you could imagine, it's quite grandiose, but it does give an interesting idea of Ramesses' perception of his youth, and more specifically, how he wanted others to remember that time. The inscription begins as follows, quote, "There came into being a son who championed his father, just like Horus did when he championed Osiris, one who formed he who had formed him, one who fashioned he who had fashioned him." Ramesses says, "I came forth from Ra, and it was Men-Ma'at Ra, Sety I, who raised me. The Lord of all, Ra himself, elevated me while I was still a child, until I became the sovereign. He assigned to me the land while I was still in the egg, that is, an infant. The great ones gave praise to me when I was appointed as the hereditary noble, and as a delegate upon the throne of Geb." End quote. The first part of the biography describes Ramesses coming forth from Ra himself, a child of the sun god destined to rule. That wasn't arrogance on Ramesses' part. During the New Kingdom, the idea of the divine birth of the king had become a standard trope. Ever since the days of Hatshepsut, rulers had commissioned texts that described the gods physically impregnating their mothers in order to create them from the divine seed. So Ramesses is placing his own birth within the established traditions of the previous royal lineage. This claim to literal divine parentage may sound disrespectful towards Sety, but again, it is a religious story, part of the ideology of the Egyptian kingship. The next part of the biography is a little more political. Ramesses turns away from his divine birth narrative and starts to focus on earthly concerns, specifically his responsibilities within the government of King Sety I, and how his father elevated him to prominence and to power. Ramesses continues, quote, "The great ones gave praise to me when I was appointed as the hereditary noble and as a delegate upon the throne of Geb. I reported on the affairs of the two lands as the chief of infantry and of chariotry." End quote. Ramesses introduces some key concepts of the succession, as it were, how Sety presented him as his chosen heir. Firstly, the great ones of the royal court give praise to him, acknowledging Ramesses as their superior and their overlord. Next, Ramesses receives the title of Iri-Pat, or hereditary noble. This is a relatively common title that appears amongst the aristocrats of the land. But from the days of Horemheb, it had also acquired a royal dimension that, in certain circumstances, seems to indicate the designated successor. It's a complicated situation, but to put it simply, not every Iri-Pat, or hereditary noble, is an heir to the throne, but every heir to the throne is an Iri-Pat. So Ramesses is describing the way that his father presented him as the next king of Egypt. He also calls himself a delegate upon the throne of Geb. Geb is the god of the earth, who rules the entire planet in the name of the creator. Naturally, the king of Egypt is an avatar of Geb among his many other identities, and so Ramesses, being a delegate to that throne, indicates that he is going to become that ruler. Finally, the young prince describes some practical government responsibilities, that he had become a military leader, overseeing infantry and chariots. Again, that was a motif used by Horemheb to introduce his own rise to power and his legitimate claim to be the king of Egypt. Since the days of Horemheb, the army commanders, the great generals, have become more visible within the government, and just as Horemheb had appointed his commander, Ramesses I, to be the successor, Ramesses I had appointed Sety to be great overseer of the army. And in turn, Sety, apparently, appointed Ramesses to be a general. Notably, all of this is happening while the prince is still a child, so he is a youth in charge of Egypt's armed forces. Whether that came with any practical authority or was purely a ceremonial position, we can only speculate. But what's important is that Ramesses includes military command as an important tick on the checklist. As he rises to become the chosen heir, that is a major responsibility. The biography now turns to an interesting and slightly controversial statement. In the next section, Ramesses goes beyond the crown prince narrative and seems to suggest that Sety I had appointed him as a kind of co-king. The story went as follows, quote, "Then, when my father, Sety I, appeared to the people, I being just a youth within his embrace, he spoke thus concerning me. Sety said, 'Crown him, Ramesses, as king, so that I may see his beauty while I am still alive. Set the great Uraeus, the serpent, upon his head. He shall govern this land, he shall care for its boundaries, he shall give commands to the people.' So said he, Sety, concerning me, while he was still upon this earth. Sety had the chamberlains summoned to set the crowns upon my brow. And he spoke of me, his eyes filled with tears. So great was the love for me within his heart." End quote. Ramesses II describes a situation in which, while his father was still alive, he was brought before the court and the people, and visibly presented as the next king. Not just the next king, but the current king as well. According to Ramesses' version of events, Sety presented him as a co-ruler during his own lifetime. This is a situation that scholars call a co-regency, in which, for one reason or another, a reigning monarch is unable to fulfill their duties alone, so they appoint their eldest son to rule alongside them as a fully invested king. Co-regencies pop up here and there within Egyptian history. The most notable examples come from the early Middle Kingdom in the 12th dynasty, and there was the famous case of Hatshepsut ruling alongside and in conjunction with her nephew Thutmose III. But from a historical perspective, co-regencies are slightly controversial. They certainly existed occasionally, but they're the exception rather than the norm. And it can be quite difficult to pinpoint when a co-regency is actually occurring versus when a king is simply presenting themselves as the continuation of their predecessor. What I mean is, historians look for very specific criteria in order to identify situations where Egypt actually had two kings at the same time. They don't happen as often as the propaganda would suggest. This brings us back to Ramesses II and his interesting description of a coronation ceremony happening in the lifetime of Sety I. For about 100 years, many Egyptologists have taken Ramesses at his word and interpreted the Abydos inscription as a record of Sety appointing Ramesses as a co-regent. We'll discuss the scholarship around that with Professor Peter Brand in just a few moments. But looking at the artifacts, the monuments, and the evidence itself, art, and inscriptions, a few scholars have found reason to believe Ramesses' account of events. For example, Egyptologists like Keith Seeley, William Murnane, Anthony Spellinger, and Kenneth Kitchen could point to monuments erected in the reign of Sety I that seem to show young Ramesses receiving crowns and acting as a king. The best example comes from the memorial or mortuary temple of Sety on the west bank of Waset or Luxor. Here, in a side hall, we have an image of the great deities of Waset, Amun-Ra, Khonsu, and Mut. They appear in the scene along with Sety himself, who stands wearing his crown and clutching the scepters of rule. In front of the gods, a figure of Ramesses appears. He kneels before Amun-Ra and receives blessings from that deity and from Mut, who stands behind Ramesses. Here, Ramesses also clutches the scepters of kingship, and he wears a truly elaborate crown that takes the forms of ram's horns sacred to Amun, the golden cobras or Uraeus serpents who protect the ruler, the feathers of Ma'at, and bundles of papyrus representing Osiris. Finally, the crown is topped with multiple sun discs, symbols of the creator Ra. Here, Ramesses appears as a fully formed king. He even has a cartouche with his Nesut Biti, or King of Southern and Northern Egypt name. That name appears in its earliest form, User Ma'at Ra, that is, powerful is the truth of Ra. This particular form of the name was only used in the first year of Ramesses' rule, the same time when he was carving that inscription at Abydos. Later, he would modify the throne name, adding new epithets and variations. In the memorial temple of Sety, on the west bank of the Nile, we find Ramesses at the very start of his reign. It all seems fairly cut and dry, right? Ramesses has this account of Sety crowning him in his presence, and we even have artistic scenes that appear to show the event. In normal circumstances, that would be good enough to confirm most historical records. Unfortunately, co-regencies are a uniquely complicated subject, and there are many issues with Ramesses' version of events. After the break, we will explore the question of Ramesses' alleged co-regency with King Sety I. The young ruler claimed to have become a monarch in the lifetime of his father, an unusual situation that only occurs rarely in Egyptian history. To understand the question fully and explore its complications, I reached out to Professor Peter Brand. Professor Brand is an Egyptologist and historian who specializes in the early 19th dynasty. He wrote his PhD and then published a book specifically about the monuments of Sety I, including the temples at Abydos and Luxor, and that PhD included a discussion of the co-regency idea. More recently, Professor Brand has published a massive book about Ramesses II himself, including his life from childhood to death, and his reign and legacy as a pharaoh of Egypt. More than most scholars currently living, Professor Brand is deeply immersed in these particular questions. So I thought we should get his expertise to untangle a thorny problem. My discussion with Peter Brand will begin after the break. I will return after the conversation to provide a summary of Professor Brand's answers and then to bring it all together as we move deeper into the reign of Sety. For now, it's time for our conversation. See you in a moment. And now, a conversation with Professor Peter Brand to discuss one particular topic. Ramesses II claimed that his father Sety I appointed him to be a co-ruler, and that they reigned together as joint kings of Egypt. But did Ramesses speak truly? And if so, what evidence supports the idea? Or, if not, how can we discount his own claims to be a co-king? This is a subject in which Professor Brand is well versed, having published on it in his own career. And who better than a Ramesses expert to get us through this problem? So, please welcome Professor Peter Brand. So, good morning, Professor Brand, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. How are you today?
Good morning. It's good to be here with you.
Okay, so I'd like to just very quickly touch on the co-regency, the hypothetical co-regency of Sety and Ramesses II, which is an idea that has kicked around for about a century now, with varying degrees of popularity. In your book, The Monuments of Sety I, which was published in 2000 based on your PhD thesis, you devoted some time to deconstructing this hypothesis, where it comes from, what the evidence for it is, and why perhaps we shouldn't give too much credence to the idea of a co-regency between Sety and Ramesses. So just to set the scene for the listener, in your understanding as an Egyptologist, what is the difference between a regular prince of Egypt or a crown prince, like a designated heir, and a co-regent specifically? What is the difference there?
Well, of course, with a crown prince, he's going to appear in the role, in the costume of a prince. He will not have the royal regalia. He won't be wearing crowns. He won't have the same authority as a king. His name will not be enclosed in the cartouche. He won't have double cartouches. He won't have the whole list of royal names, titles, and what's called the fivefold titulary. And also, he will not be able to date the years during this time with what is called a regnal year dating system. So all of these factors are limited only to the king, and the vast majority of future kings during the reigns of their father, and even proponents of co-regencies would argue that this is the case, remained as, if you will, as crown prince until their father died and then came to the throne. However, there are some cases where scholars have claimed that for various reasons, usually having to do something with a perceived need to guarantee the succession, that a king decided that his son, usually his crown prince, should be made, if you will, co-king, should be made a second king alongside himself and have just about all the privileges and markers of kingship, being able to wear the crowns, having his personal name enclosed into cartouche and taking on the coronation name so that he has two cartouches and taking on the other royal names and titles so that he has the full fivefold set of titulary. Now, some scholars, such as my mentor Bill Murnane, had argued in his book on Egyptian co-regencies that some of these kings also, these younger kings that were co-regents, also had the right to independently date their reigns separately from the years of their father. So, for instance, there was this argument that this Middle Kingdom king, Senwosret the first, who comes apparently to the throne, if you buy the co-regency theory, in the 20th year of his father Amenemhet I's reign, that by the death of Amenemhet I in his 30th year, it is then Senwosret the first's 10th year. And so these are separate dates, even though they're for the same time period. And Murnane had originally believed that in the alleged Sety and Ramesses co-regency, that Ramesses as well had begun to date his regnal years, independently of Sety I. Now, there are scholars, in fact, many scholars who have rejected most or all co-regencies. And two of the more famous issues of co-regencies besides Sety and Ramesses, of course, in the New Kingdom are the case of allegedly Akhenaten and his father Amenhotep III, and about the only other case where we could actually say that this was an actual co-regency without a doubt was the case of Queen Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. And again, even people that would reject co-regencies by and large would accept that Hatshepsut was co-ruler, that she reigned as king at the same time as Thutmose III did until her own death, although this only started about several years into the reign of Thutmose III after her husband had died. But interestingly, when she did actually begin to consider herself pharaoh, she began to count her reign, from year 7 as if she had been a pharaoh all along. So she didn't, make her year 1 the same as year 7. She just made her regnal years identical to his. But she's sort of the exception that proves the rule, and not one that other pharaohs would want to imitate necessarily, since she was such an unorthodox ruler.
So, broadly speaking, where did this idea that Sety I specifically appointed Ramesses to be a co-king alongside him. Where did that emerge from, both in the scholarship and the evidence, so to speak?
Well, the idea, I think, goes back to some of the 19th century early Egyptological historians that had been writing about it. The first really detailed treatment was done by a University of Chicago scholar, Keith Seeley. And there's basically some textual and some artistic evidence that seems to suggest or could suggest that these two kings ruled together. The most explicit evidence comes from an inscription that Ramses engraved on the facade of his father's cult temple at Abydos, the famous beautiful temple of Sety I at Abydos, where early in his reign, after Seti's death, and this is a point where even co-regency proponents would say is after Seti's death, that Ramses carved an inscription where he talked about in part his career under Sety I, how he was promoted, how he was trained to be a king in waiting. But there's even a scene that's given that's very touching where Sety says to the courtiers and the chamberlains, bring the crown and place it on his head that I might see his beauty while I'm still alive. And then as this is done, we see this wonderful spectacle of Sety shedding tears of joy and pride as his young son is crowned. And it's a very touching story. And it's actually very similar to other kinds of royal origin stories that are told about events that never really quite happened, a kind of political mythology. And in fact, the closest parallel is the case of another fictitious coronation, where supposedly Queen Hatshepsut, never mind her co-regency with what is often called her nephew or whatever he was, Tutmosis III, she actually claims that she was first crowned as pharaoh by her father, Tutmosis I, in a very detailed textual account along with imageries that shows her seated as king or kneeling as king before her enthroned father, Tutmosis I, which completely ignores the reign of her own husband, Tutmosis II, and is an utter piece of, if you will, mythological fiction or political mythology. Not that she or Sety or Ramses were trying to lie or misrepresent history. This was a kind of political mythology. And so in that context, I think we can take this scene of Ramses being crowned as prince and Sety's, shedding tears of joy and pride as just so much political mythology and shouldn't be taken as literal. But very often these kind of texts are considered to be quote unquote historical text and therefore often taken at face value. But this is the most explicit evidence. Now, art historically, we often have scenes in some of these temples, especially ones that were built during the reign of Sety but never completed, such as his cult temple at Abydos, his cult temple on the west bank of Thebes at Gourna, and also his parts of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, where you often see images of Sety alongside Ramses II, where they're both shown as king. Perhaps the most common type are scenes like we see in the hypostyle hall or sometimes in the Gourna temple, and a few times in the Abydos temple, where the deified Sety is worshipped by Ramses II. And so the question is he alive or dead when he is being shown adored by his son? And various arguments have been put forward of pro or con, although I think it's much more likely that Sety has passed on. And the nearest parallels are cases where we can be quite certain that the previous king has died, as when we see sometimes images, for instance, of kings worshiping long dead monarchs, such as Tutmosis III worshiping a Middle Kingdom pharaoh, or Tutankhamun paying homage to his grandfather Amenhotep III. So in that case, I think it's a bit of weak evidence. We also sometimes see scenes such as we see in the hypostyle hall of the Gourna temple of Sety I, wherein there are alternating wall scenes, where one scene shows Sety and the next scene shows Ramses worshiping the gods, or where we see scenes where Ramses as king is worshiping the gods, or sometimes kneeling to receive regalia from the gods, and standing by, witnessing the scene is the deified Sety I, which some people will take these scenes as evidence of the quote unquote coronation of Ramses during the lifetime of Sety. But they belong to a kind of genre of scenes that are very common, where kings kneel or stand in the presence of gods who bestow regalia on them, crowns and scepters and other symbols of rule, and confirm their rule. And these are not representations of a historical event like, last year's, coronation of King Charles, but rather are, idealized scenes of the eternal approval and legitimation of the pharaoh by the gods themselves, who demonstrate their ongoing support for his rule by making these gestures that are represented in the temple artwork. So in all these cases, while you could interpret them as evidence of a co-regency, they're much more likely to be representations of Ramses honoring his father's memory, especially in monuments that were built, or at least partly built and decorated by Sety himself. Sety's two temples at Abydos and Gorna, as well as the hypostyle hall, which he had built and partly decorated. But what's really interesting is that there are two temples from the period at the very beginning of Ramses' reign that, according to the proponents of the co-regency theory, would have been built while Sety is still alive. And this is a small temple in Nubia called Beta Wali, and a smaller temple at Abydos that's right next to Sety's own temple. And these are doubtlessly built at the very beginning of Ramses' reign. And one of the ways we can tell inscriptions that are dated at the beginning of Ramses' reign is that there are a number of unusual aspects of the way he carved his reliefs, as well as the way he spelled his cartouche names, especially his coronation names, that allow us to detect early phases of his temple decoration during his first year or so. And so we know that these other temples of Ramses date to the period at the beginning of his reign, that if there was a co-regency, that they would have been built while Sety was alive. And if there was not a co-regency, they would have been built just after Sety's death. Now, these are temples that Ramses built himself, and everybody would agree with that. And in the Beta Wali temple, we never see an image of Sety at all. And in the Abydos temple, there is only one statue and one scene that shows Sety in the context of being a divine being worshipped by Ramses, or in a group of four gods on a statue that includes the deified Osiris and Isis, but also Ramses and Sety themselves as gods alongside these two Abydos gods. And so when you compare the monuments that are supposedly built by Sety, in which he's allowing Ramses, if there's a co-regency, to generously take up space to decorate these monuments, and yet Ramses, who's the junior partner, is building his own monuments and will not begrudge his father, the senior member, the privilege of appearing in Ramses' own temple, and the idea that Sety's still alive, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And one of the things I noted in my book on the Sety I is that if you examine the co-regency from the perspective of Ramses II, it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, people have often looked at it from the perspective of trying to figure out, well, what was the early career of Ramses II? But if you look at it from the perspective of Sety I, it doesn't really make any sense at all, because constantly we see him deferring his own royal authority to that of his young son, of allowing his own son to hog the limelight. And this doesn't sound like a very pharaonic thing to do, where you would expect kings to jealously guard their power until the very end. and would be loath to to share the spotlight in this same way. Increasingly, it seemed to me less and less likely that just about any pharaoh would allow this, even under the most desperate circumstances. Promoting their son as crown prince, and I think Sety went to great lengths to promote Ramses as crown prince, and did so in a more activist or more open fashion than most pharaohs did. But that taking that last step of ceding, equal power and equal status is something that both violates the Egyptian mythology of kingship, of every living pharaoh is to be Horus, and every deceased king is to be Osiris. And when the old king dies, he becomes Osiris. How can you have two horses on the throne at the same time? Or could Sety now become an Osiris before his death, but while his son reigned as Horus? So just from the archetype of Egyptian kingship mythology, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Again, from the perspective of Sety being quite satisfied and jealous of his power, of ceding that much authority to his young son, especially one that was still king in training, also seems highly unlikely. And in fact, almost the only way I could argue, and I think I may have said this almost sort of ironically, is perhaps the only way I could imagine Sety having Ramses as a co-regent would almost be the Egyptian equivalent of why sometimes senile kings in European history often had the crown prince or some other member of the family be regent. So, for instance, when you think about George III, who went mad at the end of his reign, and George IV, who was then Prince of Wales, basically ran the show. And some scholars have, I think Anthony Spallinger did this, have tried to argue that although Ramses wore the crowns and all the rest of it, that he was actually a prince regent. And Kitchen uses the term regency, whereas Murnane uses the term co-regency. And for instance, between Murnane and Kitchen, the only difference that they saw was that Kitchen didn't believe Ramses used the independent regnal year dating system, but that otherwise they both agreed that Ramses had all the regalia and titulary of kingship and all the right to wear the crown, etc. And so also did Spallinger. But from my point of it, whether you call it a co-regency, a regency, or a prince regency, a rose by any other name is still the same. Moreover, I hardly think that the most important thing that Sety would guard as his most privileged aspect of kingship is the right to date the events of his reign, but then he would happily give up the unique right to wear the crowns and to have a royal titulary. So those were the most sacred parts of kingship and the right to absolute power. So it made much more sense, as always, for there to be a crown prince. And in Seti's case, he had a very good need to promote his crown prince, a new dynasty hanging by a genetic thread. Ramses was the crown prince. He had to be trained. All that we could talk about at another time, but I don't think Sety had the need to take his son as co-regent. And throughout his own reign, Ramses, even when he became very old, at the end of his reign, when his last crown prince, Merneptah, was virtually ruling the country in his name, was never made co-regent.
And that you touched on an interesting point there regarding the regnal dates, which brings up the point that for the earlier scholars, particularly Keith Seeley and I think to a lesser extent Murnane, their analyses were still operating on the assumption that Sety might have ruled as long as 20 years or more, which perhaps for them gave a more comfortable buffer zone in which Ramesses might be taking an active role in the kingship, while Sety still has an extended independent period. But you've made a, in my opinion, quite strong argument that the reign of Sety really is at most 10 full years and maybe part of the 11th. From that perspective, it seems like the logic of a co-regency, if Ramesses is telling it exactly accurately, he would have had to be made co-regent almost in year one of Sety and been co-regent the whole time, which doesn't match with the evidence. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, I would think so. And also the views on this have changed. I mean, back in the day, James Henry Brest did seem to suggest that Sety ruled long enough to celebrate a jubilee, which traditionally takes place in the 30th year. Seeley, I think, I can't remember how long. I thought he had argued that the co-regency went on for something like 10 years. But again, I think he had this higher estimate, as did Kitchen, that Sety's reign went on for about 15 years or so, 14, 16, but about 15. More recently, other scholars, including myself, had also argued that it was more likely to be either 10 or 11 full years. The highest known year date is regnal year 9. And then we know that Seti's accession date and Ramses' succession date were separated by 3 days. Ramses' succession date was 3 days after the anniversary of Seti's accession date. So in other words, Sety would have died a couple of days into a new regnal year. So if he ruled until the beginning of his 10th regnal year, then he would have died a couple of days after that. If he made it to the end of that, then he would have died a few days after the end of his 11th. We used to think we had a regnal year 11 inscription, but this is on a damaged inscription from Jebel Barkal. But this has now been redated to regnal year 2. So it leaves us a couple of regnal year 9 inscriptions as being our only evidence for the maximum length of his reign. But obviously he must have completed regnal year 9 because he did a lot during that time. So at least he died shortly after the beginning of year 10, or possibly at the beginning of his 11th year.
Mm. Okay, so looking at it from the Egyptological perspective, the idea of the co-regency has stuck around a surprisingly long time, to the point that even a recent book by Toby Wilkinson kind of accepted it as fact. What is, from your understanding of the scholarship, since you've dived so deeply into it, what is the appeal of this particular concept? Why does it keep hanging around in scholarship, even when the evidence itself seems to be quite weak when you dive into it?
Well, I think the evidence, to be fair to the proponents, it is somewhat ambiguous. I do think that it was the case that there had never been a systematic argumentation against the co-regency, and I wouldn't necessarily say there was a silent majority against it, but there was a silent opposition to it. No, I mean, first you had Seeley's book on the co-regency of Ramses. The second was Sety I and the date of the Great Hypostyle Hall. Notice that it's the co-regency of Ramses with Sety, not the co-regency of Sety with Ramses. And then we have the earlier reign of Ramses II and his co-regency with Sety I by Murnane in the 70s. And then traces of the early career of Ramses II by Spallinger, which is about what he calls the Prince Regency. There were no major rebuttals to those, even though there were lots of scholars that didn't buy them. And so it was like there was no really challenge to the idea. And I never expected to challenge it in my dissertation. I thought it was settled. And then as I was looking at the chronology of various inscriptions and reliefs in the temples that Sety had built and that had been completed by Ramses, I noticed that there were certain things that didn't make sense in terms of the chronology if there was a co-regency. And so I looked into it and came to realize there wasn't a co-regency, and that all the evidence in favor of a co-regency could be explained by assuming that that Ramses had created these inscriptions after Seti's death as a memorial to him. Now, a place where you see the co-regency theory sort of, refusing to die, even though I think it is safe to say that the vast majority of Egyptologists at this point don't buy it, is the infamous case of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, and which has always had a vociferous following of proponents, although it has also had those who have argued against it and who also reject it. And there, the pushback has been more successive, even though, again, most of the scholarship has been in favor of it. I think it's one of those cases where it's sort of an outlier theater, that the theory that the people that buy it, yell the loudest, and the people that don't just basically, stick their fingers in their ear and just, wish it would just stop. And Murnane, interestingly enough, who of course wrote the book on co-regencies, it was his dissertation topic, but was a very intellectually honest man. And he told me, I said, how come you don't believe in the co-regency of these two? And he had written about it and even put forward new evidence against the co-regency. And he said, well, I would love there to be a co-regency of these two kings. I just don't buy the evidence for it. And so, yeah, in many ways, it has to do with just how partisan or invested, almost emotionally, or perhaps even emotionally, some scholars are in these co-regency theories. Although others have written them off. I mean, the French scholar, I'm trying to remember what his name now, but dismissed the Akhenaten Amenhotep the third case as what he called an Egyptological fantasy.
Very good. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my questions about the co-regency. And in the future, we'll have an opportunity to discuss the rise of Ramesses as a prince, and then the transition to his independent kingship after the death of Sety I. But first of all, thank you very much for answering these questions. I think you know it and can explain it much more deeply than I can. So thank you very much for answering that. And in the future, when we come to Ramesses II, I think we can take an opportunity to see how he rewrites, or at least presents, his own past in what you have called a sort of mythologizing fashion. So thank you very much for answering that. And we'll come back to this in the future as to more from Ramesses' perspective.
Thank you.
Okay. My thanks to Professor Brand for explaining that situation in far more detail than I could ever do. To bring it all round, to summarize the situation as we know it, once he became king in his own right, Ramesses II claimed that his father Sety had promoted him as a co-ruler. He made this claim in monumental inscriptions at the great temple of Abju, or Abydos, and he depicted scenes that were analogous to the idea in monuments constructed by Sety, but subsequently finished by Ramesses himself. For some scholars, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these accounts and images seemed to provide robust evidence that Ramesses and Sety had reigned side by side, at least for a limited time. Unfortunately, Ramesses' version of events is far less reliable than we may desire. For one thing, there is no evidence that King Sety and Ramesses ever had independent but simultaneous regnal dates. There are no records of a year 6 of Sety and a year 1 of Ramesses side by side. Looking solely at the dates and calendars for the reign, it appears quite clear that it went Sety I and then Ramesses II, with no discernible overlap. Additionally, the artistic scenes in which Ramesses presents himself receiving crowns in the presence of his father, those may appear in temples of Sety I, but there is a problem here as well. The images that seem to confirm Ramesses becoming a co-king all appear in monuments which Sety constructed and started decorating, but which were incomplete when he finally died. With that in mind, there's a strong possibility that Ramesses used the opportunity of finishing his father's monuments to retroactively increase his own status and prominence. Finally, while Ramesses may have been eager to present his own past as an inevitable rise to kingship, looking at things from Sety's perspective, Professor Brand points out there's really very little reason to think Sety would voluntarily do this. He might promote his son as the designated, chosen heir to the throne, but to go that extra step and make him a co-king? Why would Sety give up some of his power unless he really needed to? In the absence of any evidence that he had such a need, it seems far more likely that Ramesses was simply rewriting the past, exaggerating his status and his influence in order to build his authority. Why he might do that, his possible motivations for such a story, those are questions for the future. For now, it is time to bring this episode to a close. As the reign of Sety I progressed and monuments rose in his name, the king took a special interest in the position and visibility of his son. Breaking with the habits of the past, Sety began to include young Ramesses in images of ritual and worship. Such scenes appear in the great temple of Abydos, and later Ramesses himself would describe his own rise to prominence as one in which he became a trusted member of the court and government, in which Sety appointed him as an overseer of the army, and then, allegedly, Sety promoted him to be a co-king. The rise of Ramesses seems to be a mix of genuine historical fact, but also a bit of political myth-making, as following his own accession, Ramesses felt the need to reshape his recent past. He did so through the imagery of a co-regency, claiming that Sety I had made him ruler to sit alongside him on the thrones of Egypt. Today, there is no tangible, reliable evidence that this actually happened, and looking at it historically, there seems very little reason for Sety to do so. What is undeniable, though, is that Sety promoted his eldest son far more than previous kings had done. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Stick around after the thank yous for a quick epilogue in which I discuss Ramesses' brother, but also his depictions in cinema. Young Ramesses has appeared in film several times across the decades, and some depictions are better than others. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but first, a couple of shoutouts. This episode was made possible thanks to my wonderful supporters on Patreon, who help supply me and my wife with the necessary offerings for our life and business. All gratitude must go to Kyla, Terry, Ashley, James, Niden, Arthur, TJ, Veronica, Yola, Ashley, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, and Linda. Folks, you are all far too generous. May the great deities of Abydos and the lords of Waset, Amun-Ra, Mut, and Khonsu bless you and ensure that your progeny, however you define that, follow you in success and happiness. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon. Around 1300 BCE, King Sety I promoted his eldest son, Ramesses, as the crown prince, the designated heir to his throne. Now, some of you may be wondering, hang on, didn't Ramesses II have an elder brother? Somebody who was Sety's heir before young Ramesses? Well, that is an old hypothesis that was popular in the early 20th century. I'll discuss the origin of that concept in a future episode, but you will find the first brother idea in some famous works of history and of fiction. For example, back in 1905, the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted described a situation where Sety's eldest son, not Ramesses, promoted himself on monuments, and maybe even ruled briefly after Sety's death. Then, in 1982, the Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen also suggested that Sety and his queen had a firstborn son, but that he died in childhood. Most famously, the French Egyptologist Christian Jacques published a series of novels dramatizing the life and times of Ramesses II. These appeared in the 1990s, 5 books in total, and they were translated into many languages. In the first volume, Le Fils de la Lumière, or Son of the Light, Jacques introduced an elder brother named Shanar. This prince, Sety's firstborn, appears as an antagonist and a thoroughly conniving and corrupt individual. Prince Shanar is totally fictional, right down to his name, which sounds Mesopotamian or Canaanite more than Egyptian. There is no historical evidence that a person by such a name existed in Sety's family, but the idea of Ramesses having an elder brother, a firstborn heir of King Sety I, that does go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, Egyptologists no longer consider the idea valid. There is a very particular explanation why this elder brother was proposed, but that is a story for another day. Finally, a quick word on representations. Ramesses II has appeared several times in popular films. The 3 biggest examples are The 10 Commandments from 1956, The Prince of Egypt from 1998, and Exodus, Gods and Kings from 2014. Each film takes a different approach to Ramesses, both in his character and his visual appearance. The most famous is easily The 10 Commandments, in which the actor Yul Brynner portrays Ramesses both as a youth and later as a pharaoh. Brynner was 33 years old when the film was released. A sizable jump in age, but not too far if we assume that Ramesses was around 20 when his father died. Brynner appears throughout the first half of the film in the guise of an Egyptian prince. He usually wears elaborate, colorful jewelry, and most notably, he appears with a shaved head and a long, thick braid running down the side. Brynner's costume as Prince Ramesses appears to be drawn from the Abydos temple scenes, which show the young prince wearing these exact garments, and allowing for the fact that no actor will exactly resemble the historical figure, Brynner cuts a pretty good likeness as young Ramesses. He is a little bit too old, but maybe that's a necessary sacrifice to bring the acting experience and appropriate gravitas. Overall, thumbs up for a well-realized depiction that is largely accurate to the historical imagery. At the other end of the spectrum, there is Joel Edgerton as young Ramesses in Exodus, Gods and Kings. The film was released in 2014, and at that time, Edgerton was already 42 years old, at least twice as old as he should have been, depicting a historical Ramesses. Unfortunately, this particular film is not good. The story is muddled and clearly cut up from a much longer version that existed in early edits. As a result, characters will lurch from sequence to sequence with very little in the way of connective tissue. This has a bad impact on the characterization of Ramesses, who starts out as a petulant, grumpy adult and doesn't really grow from there. On the visual side of things, it's a bit better. Ramesses' costumes are quite good. They're often based on garments found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, who died just a few decades before Ramesses, so the clothing is usually pretty good. The hair is a sore point. Ramesses never has his thick braid or side lock associated with a youthful prince. And while his head is shaved, he goes through much of the film with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, which, whether accurately or not, gives him a decidedly modern appearance. It's a strange choice, and I would love to know if they tested the side lock but decided it didn't work, or if they simply felt that a more modern hairstyle would make him more relatable. The same issue affects Christian Bale, Ben Mendelsohn, and many of the other actors in the film. which unfortunately makes it seem very much like they just stepped out of a costuming department. So the hair is a particular bugbear for me in this film. I'll give it a C- on the basis of the clothing, which is quite accurately portrayed, but overall, it's not great. Far and away the best depiction is the animated film The Prince of Egypt. Here, the character is voiced by Ralph Fiennes, who gives a surprisingly strong performance of the young prince. He sounds a little bit too British, but that's Hollywood for you. But leaving that aside, Fiennes' performance as young Ramesses is a well-developed one. We get a strong sense of Ramesses as a teenager, energetic, impetuous, but also insecure. And he develops organically and meaningfully through the story into the villainous pharaoh of the Exodus tale. The storytelling of this film is far and away the most efficient and effective of the three versions. Additionally, the visual depiction of young Ramesses is quite simply excellent. Because the film was animated, the designers could look to the actual artistic images of young Ramesses in order to craft his appearance. Again, they seem to have used the Abydos imagery as their primary template. Here, the image of Ramesses is startlingly good. For the boy's profile, they have clearly looked to his artistic depictions at Abydos and elsewhere, but also to his remarkably well-preserved mummy. The results are on point, as close to life as you could reasonably expect from an animated portrayal. The shape of his nose is correct, his cheeks are stylized but relatively similar to his cadaverous mummy, and the lips are probably pretty close to how they appeared in life. That is all subjective, of course, but to my eye, he cuts a very similar figure to the artistic depictions and his mummified body. In terms of the costuming, it's definitely not as strong as the Ten Commandments or Exodus, Gods and Kings. For one thing, the finer details of the jewelry and the garments, those are much harder to replicate frame by frame in an animated medium. So the visual design here tends to take more of a simplistic, or shall we say minimalist approach. There is less emphasis on the tiny details, and more on the silhouettes, on strong profiles and recognizable iconography. In that sense, it's a pretty good adaptation of the spirit of ancient Egyptian temple art, which, famously, is not trying to convey life in a realistic, naturalist manner, but to convey an idea of certain principles and philosophies. Whether it was intentional or accidental, the Prince of Egypt did a pretty good job at subtly following those ideas. Like the Ten Commandments, this depiction does include Ramesses' side lock, that distinctive braid which appears in the temple art. This version is shorter and far more simplified than the one we see in the Ten Commandments. That is understandable. Hair is notoriously difficult to animate, and making a highly detailed braid that runs down to shoulder length, that probably would have been expensive to animate, and might even have been distracting in the style of the film itself. So I won't judge them too harshly on the side lock. At least they include it, even in a reduced form. Overall, I have to say that The Prince of Egypt is easily the best visual depiction of young Ramesses. They do have an advantage. It's much easier to draw a prince that resembles his artistic depictions, rather than taking a living actor and making them look like the art. So The Prince of Egypt does have an advantage. But even taking that into account, this is probably the strongest depiction of the prince. It is the one that brings the historical reality from his mummified body and the artistic scenes as close as possible to something that works in a visual and narrative format. The Ten Commandments is easily the second best, and Yul Brynner's performance is particularly strong. The worst, apart from the costuming, is Exodus, Gods and Kings, which makes some unfortunate choices in the narrative, storytelling, and casting of the prince. So, out of 3 films, we have a pretty broad spread of depictions for young Ramesses II. None of them is 100% perfect. They all have their positives and their negatives. But given the subject matter at hand, we do get a surprisingly broad sweep of depictions. I wonder which one Ramesses would most appreciate.